Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Many of you have probably heard of regulatory capture, whereby the very organizations that government agencies are supposed to monitor and regulate end up getting favors and special privileges from those very agencies. Over the last few days, I read an article that I thought was fascinating, which was about media capture. And the author I've had on a couple times before, so I reached out to him to come and talk to us about it today. He's the editor at large of the Foundation for Economic Education. His writing and reporting have been the subject of articles in Time Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and Forbes, amongst others. And he also writes a Substack called The Take. Jon Miltimore, welcome back.
Hey, thanks. Great to be with you, Michael.
So there's a figure, a political figure from South America who was the basis for your article. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Javier Milei. Uh, who is he?
Milei is a new president of Argentina, and he's a pretty interesting and unique fellow. He's the first libertarian president of a Western country in modern history. And how one chooses to, we've had conversations on this, like how one chooses to define a libertarian. But at least in modern history, Milei is the first. And he was elected last fall after Argentina, had really gone into a death spiral economically. Argentina was once one of the most prosperous countries in South America. If you go back a century, its GDP was on par with like Canada. That changed. Peronism has dominated the political landscape there for about the last 70 years. And that's, we get the term from a former president who was a Peronist, as were his, those who followed. And basically, what his political philosophy was, it was a mix of National Socialism and fascism. Um, it's kind of an incoherent, political economic philosophy when you look at it, but that's the best way to describe it. And Argentina's economy that was so prosperous really has suffered. It happened over decades. And I think that's important for Americans to understand, because I've made the argument our trajectory is really similar to Argentina's in some respects. They had it started with just growth in government that really led to a decline in economic growth, a massive growth of government programs, which really caused a ton of money printing. And it started, all that money printing was going on for years and years. You can go look at it, and it's one of those, it's a steady thing. And then all of a sudden you hit 2020 and it blew up exponentially. And if to put it into perspective, they grew their money supply by about um, 20 times in just a span of a very, you know, of a handful of years. And what that did is our inflation in Argentina now is about 250%, annually. And it keeps creeping up. If you went back 6 months ago, inflation was probably 120%, then went to 140, then 180, and then right now it's about 240%, 250, something like that. The poverty rate in Argentina is a new report just came out, so I can be very specific, like 57.9%. Think of that. 58% of the population in poverty in a country that was not poor very long ago. I have a coworker, and her boyfriend lives in their family's in Argentina, and she goes down there quite often, and interviews people while she's there and explores. But if you go down, like they're changing prices throughout the day because inflation is going up that quickly. So Argentina is in bad shape, and Malay comes in, and he kind of out of nowhere. He's a newbie as far as I think he had served like one term in parliament, but he's very much a libertarian, and he's not like one of these libertarians that kind of calls himself one. He's very well schooled in Austrian economics. Like he really understands the freedom philosophy, but his task is a monumental one. You're trying to bring a country back from the brink of economic collapse. Um, but even for people who support Malay, recognize this is a very tall order, because you're not a dictator for one. You can't just do everything you want to do. You have to build political coalitions. You got to get buy-in, to fix some of these problems. And whether or not he can do that, we'll find out. But I noticed recently we had some very good news in the first, again, he's only been a president for what, maybe 10, 12 weeks, something like that. And we got new numbers back. Argentina ran a budget surplus in January for the first time in like a dozen years. That's something Washington, D.C. hasn't had a budget surplus, for more than 20 years. You got to go back to like the first year of the George W. Bush administration. So to me, like this is pretty impressive. Right out of the gate, you're able to get a budget surplus just that fast. And how Milei did it, he's for people that might not be as familiar with him, there's a lot of pictures you'll see with him with a chainsaw, and that's what he said. We need to take a chainsaw to the federal budget, and he quickly came in and he just started eliminating some of these departments, especially the most ridiculous ones. Like you had some of these departments on social equity and some things that they have like almost Orwellian names. And it's wild. You have a country that is slipping into mass poverty, but you have these government programs that most people can't even really explain what they are or what they're doing. And Milei said, no, 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 and he just started lopping departments. He put any new employees that were hired in the last 12 months. They said, nope, we're not, and we're not going to spend money. We're not going to spend money on public relations for media and for government media and all these things. And he really aggressively tackled government spending, and they had a $500 million surplus in January. So to me, that was like incredible. And what was shocking to me is I couldn't find any news of this in US media. I was actively looking because I think I first saw a tweet about this, and then I went to Google and I saw, well, it's reported in Australia. It's reported in France and some European media. Nothing in U.S. media about this until finally I saw one op-ed in like the New York Sun or something that had reported it. But I'm like, I'm trying to understand why. If you look, the Associated Press and Reuters and the New York Times and the Washington Post, all of these publications had been reporting endlessly on, like they've been covering events in Argentina very closely. But here you have a major headline, right? Like a major victory, that you've managed to have the first budget surplus in a dozen years, and there's no reporting on it. In fact, I went in Reuters and the AP after this was announced. They had very negative stories looking at the high poverty in Argentina, which had been going on. Again, like inflation, poverty has just been creeping up over for years in Argentina because of these, Peronist policies that have been for literally decades, right? And there, after you have this big victory, you're going to report a negative study showing that poverty in Argentina is still going up, and that was a bit alarming to me, and it did get me thinking about what is the purpose of media? What should a media be doing? Why do some stories get reported, and why don't some get reported? And that's when I'm familiar with regulatory capture. I've heard of media capture, but I decided to explore that a little bit in the article you mentioned.
Okay. So Javier Milei comes into office very recently, takes a chainsaw to all these agencies, and now Argentina has a budget surplus. Just to give the audience a sense of the accomplishment, what would the equivalent be for the United States? So if somebody came into office in the United States and accomplished something comparable to what Milei accomplished, what would it look like?
I guess the easiest explanation, both countries have different budget struggles, and trying to do the math, out of the gate would be difficult. But I'll say this, like look at what the United States right now is running for an annual deficit. Um, I think we peaked recently at $2.8 trillion. Think of that. And now we're fighting to get the deficit under 2 trillion again. Anybody that came in and could run a surplus, I think that would be the equivalent. If you can say we're 2 trillion in the hole each year, and suddenly we have say you're running $1 trillion surplus. Like that would be incredible, right? But it could happen. Like I'm convinced it could happen. But it would take the sort of prescription Milei is offering. And I will say there's nobody in the United States offering that prescription. No leading political candidate, certainly. Not Joe Biden, not Donald Trump. I'm not sure who the libertarian candidate will be. I haven't even really seen who's prominent and running. So maybe they would offer that solution. But that is what makes Milei different than any politician out there today. He's talking about aggressively reducing government spending, and no other leading political candidate in any country is doing that.
So what about Republicans like a Rand Paul, a Thomas Massey, or the Freedom Caucus? Would any of these guys have the chutzpah to do what Milei has done? I doubt it. For just going by my experience with American politics, I doubt it. But I just want to get your thoughts on
That's
it.
a tough one. I actually think a Rand Paul or a Massey might, right? Like they can, to me, at least talk about these things in a way that Milei does. But they're the outliers, right? I don't know if you could name another person besides those two guys in the Republican caucus that could do that. You name the two guys I think that could, because if you look, what is Massey doing? He's talking about, and not just talking, he introduced a bill to terminate the Department of Education. And that is what we're talking about. We're talking about serious cuts. We're not, the GOP is in love with offering tax cuts. They've been doing it for the last 20, 30, 40 years. That's nobody has really talked serious about reducing government since you go back to Reagan, at least talked the game. The problem, Reagan, what his entire term was dealing with a Democratic,
Right.
Congress. But at least Reagan did give lip service to that. I don't think any presidential candidate or president since has, and even Reagan didn't have any success for the most part. Like there was a massive expansion of government under Reagan, and I think to fix the problems in the United States, I think I'm to the point where I'm not sure they can be fixed, but to the extent that they can be, it will require someone like Milei. But I do think we'll probably have to get in a predicament. It pains me to say this. I do think it's going to have to get much worse, like what we're seeing in Argentina, before we see someone that can come in like Milei and get elected. Because the average American, they're just not thinking about things in this way. And the system itself, the American system, makes it very difficult to get change, no matter who's elected. Like the founders made a government by design that it was very difficult to get an agenda through, and that's the strength of the American system. But it becomes a weakness when you need to get problems fixed, because we're deeply divided on what plagues this country, right? If you talk to the left and the new left, they're still talking about making education free, about abolishing student loans, about doing all this stuff. Like they seem to think we can just keep printing money indefinitely. Republicans are more like, okay, let's just tap the brakes on this, keep things going like they are, but there's not a real urgency to do anything like Milei's doing.
A couple things. One, normally when they talk about cuts, what they mean is cuts in the rate of growth. They're not actually cutting anything. They're just saying, well, right now the budget's growing by, 5%. Let's cut it to 3. I mean, those are hypothetical numbers, but that's basically what they do. But
100%.
you made an interesting point about the founding fathers, because they intentionally made it very difficult for things to get done, because at the time we had a relatively free country, and by making it difficult to get things done, it would stop the growth of government. But now we're over 200 years later, the government has grown it took a lot of time because of the blocks they put in there, but now it's so big, but now it sort of backfires because you can't get anything done when you need to slash these government programs.
No, that's totally true. Like you look at, things like you can filibuster. Like even if you had majorities, you can still filibuster so you kind of need a super majority to get things done. And let's say you do get some positive legislation passed that really would make serious cuts. What you're going to have are all this federal court system where you can have, states that sue the government, and it has to go through a federal court, then an appellate court, and then it takes years to get things through to the Supreme Court. The American system, like its strengths become its weaknesses when you're trying to make um, serious changes. But that is what we require because, if you look, we're spending annually now $1 trillion just to service our debt, and our federal debt's close to $35 trillion now, and it's gonna grow a lot more very rapidly. Like over here, the next 10 years, the next 12 years, you're going to see programs running out of money. It requires serious changes, but Washington's pretty dysfunctional. I say pretty. No, Washington is dysfunctional right now. You don't need to say pretty dysfunctional. So how all of this stuff gets directed or corrected, I really don't know. That's right. I said I'm not sure it does. Like you hear these conversations over national divorce. I happen to think that would not be the worst thing for us if we could have something like that peacefully. Like, could that happen peacefully? I don't know. But I see, the apparatus, the Leviathan in Washington, D.C., it's fighting to survive, and it's fighting ruthlessly to survive. And it doesn't seem to mind what it destroys in its path as long as it keeps the system as it's going. We're kind of an empire now. We're sprawled all over the world and have all these interests across the globe. And these bureaucracies are really are really rogue, and they're operating with very little oversight. But what's terrifying, even when they get caught doing things like things that are clearly unlawful, both big and small, there's never any accountability. Like to take a small example, I did a piece a couple weeks ago on a FBI case that had been trickling down for several years, where they got a warrant to go and raid these safety deposit boxes from a Beverly Hills business, where like, over 1,000 people that had storing their stuff in these safety deposit boxes. The judge approved a very narrow warrant and said, okay, you think there's drugs being moved through here. What I'm not letting you do is to just go raid people's safety deposit boxes and keep whatever you want. He said, he was very specific in the warrant. Well, that's exactly what the FBI did. They just took everything. Anything that was over $5,000, they confiscated. It was civil asset forfeiture, and they made it clear they weren't going to give it back. And all these people sued, and the Ninth Circuit finally said, whoa, 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 you can't do this. And you were told not to do this. This is like the Revolutionary War practice where British soldiers would come in and take things and say, well, you had contraband. And there's a reason the Founding Fathers created the Fourth Amendment. It was for just stuff like this. And they were rebuked by the Ninth Circuit. But who's going to be held accountable for that? I don't think anyone will. In fact, the woman that organized that, she'll probably get a promotion out of it. And so that's deeply alarming to me when I see bureaucracy out of control. They get caught, they get rebuked, but nothing happens.
I do want to get to the media capture stuff, but you mentioned national divorce, and my main problem with the whole concept of national divorce is whom is going to do the divorcing from who? Because from what I could see, it's not as if, from my perspective, as somebody that favors individual rights, capitalism, that there's any group or state that is going to, separate, that's going to implement these things. None. So from my perspective, I don't know what good it would do. Now, if you're a hardcore Christian conservative and you live in some, a very Christian district or a district state, maybe it makes sense. But from my perspective, it just doesn't, because the ideas just aren't there.
Yeah, there's a couple of things to look at here. The first one is everyone has a right to revolt. It's something that goes back. John Locke talked about this in some of his earliest works, and that was what the underpinning was for the American Revolution. Said no, people have the right to do this. And Jefferson, believed strongly in it and wrote about this on and on. And he spelled it out in the Declaration of Independence that every people has the right, when their government becomes an oppressive force, to liberate itself. And I believe you have that. Now that can be very complicated. I think it makes sense for, morally and strategically to make sure this is done peacefully. I happen to think Gandhi and MLK were some of the most successful revolutionary people in the 20th century because they embraced nonviolence, and I believe that. So I think it is important for people first to understand we have the right. Now your question about who would do it, I happen to think the best case scenario would be, let's say Donald Trump. I'm not a Trump supporter for what it's worth, but let's say Donald Trump wins the election, and you had California that says, no, we're not doing this. Like, we're not like the left hates Trump with a fury that's almost impressive, right? And if you had a state that just said, no, we are not going to do this, in a movement that took off, I would support California's right to do that. And I would say the same if it was New York. Now let's say Biden wins in South Carolina. If people there, you have a right to organize that movement and to decide you want to do that. And I'm not telling people to do that. I do want people to recognize they have the right. Now, I don't see any of this in the short term, unless like it is maybe a Trump elected, and some, progressives out in California decide, nope, we're gonna go our own way. We have a massive economy here. We don't need to be part of that. But I think the average American is frightened by this, and they're right to be frightened. I don't want to minimize how I'm frightened by that discussion. Like, I'm not really prepared for to go down that road, even though I think my brain tells me it might be the only way long term we can go, because I do look at what Washington is mostly an oppressive force now that is doing things that aren't good. But it does frighten me, even this kind of talk. So I don't want to minimize it. It's quite serious. But I'll end it there. Because you could talk about that one all day.
Yes, you could. You really could. Okay. First of all, what is a good working definition of media capture, and how does it apply to the case of Milei?
Yeah, I think media capture is, it doesn't, I'll stress this right away, it doesn't have to involve government. It's when you have agencies that are supposed to be holding accountable those in powers, when they become captured either by those that they're supposed to hold into power, or those who support them. And I think it's important to understand first, like, what is the purpose of media? Like, we look at media, and everyone agrees, right and left, that media should be independent, right? That you want an independent media to hold in, it's sort of a check to those in power. Now, I think where you have a separation is, when you say those in power, I think for the progressives, they mostly look at powerful corporations and things. I think more libertarians and those on the right look at those in power. They mean holding those in political power, and government agencies to account. But it can be either one. And I think some of the examples I cited are the obvious ones that you can go back and say, let's say that you have media is supposed to, a corporation is dumping stuff on wetlands that's toxic, and you have an agency there that's supposed to hold them account, but they're not on the game. And so a reporter finds out this is happening, and wants to blow the whistle on this, but you have, say, a sponsor of that network who says, whoa, 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 well, this is, they have business connections here, and they say, we don't want you to run that story, and here's why. And if you do, we're going to withhold our ad dollars, and we're going to pull funding for this, okay? And that's one form of media capture, because you have advertisers who have a lot of sway over networks, over newspapers. Like, I didn't name a company, but think of Pfizer, right? Like think about throughout the pandemic, we saw all these Pfizer commercials. And it occurred to me at one point, like, there's no one is questioning this idea that the government's forcing people to take vaccines, or like, you'll lose your job if you don't do this. And media were very compliant, and I think it's because Pfizer, whose market cap was $300 billion at the time, had very outsized influence at these various media, whether it was the New York Times or MSNBC. And I think any reporter that was going to do critical stories on Pfizer probably would have ran into into problems. Um, if you think about an example I did cite, think about the Jeffrey Epstein case, right? Like there was a reporter, Amy Robach at I think she was at ABC at the time, but she got a good story. It was a victim of she had been trafficked by Epstein, and people had used her. And one of the people she was going to discuss was Prince Andrew, who she alleges um, when she was underage had this affair. Amy Robach got a story. She got a witness account. Like it's a big. This is during the Me Too stuff. ABC killed the story. They went run it, and Robach said like the royal family just said, you want interviews with Prince and Kate, with Princess Kate and William. You can't, like, and I'm sure they communicated that more subtly, but that's a form of media capture that you have powerful people that say, no, you can't report this or else. So I think those examples work. I think the biggest example is government. And government is involved in US media in ways that we don't know, right? We know they're involved. The extent to which they're involved is very unclear, but there's some examples we can look at. And one old example I cited was a Rolling Stone story that from like 1977. And it was reported by Carl Bernstein, a legendary reporter who broke Watergate with Bob Woodward. And in this piece, Bernstein is citing CIA documents that showed the CIA had hundreds of journalists on their payroll that they would work with to get stories that were sympathetic to whatever agenda they had. And I linked to that story in my article. If anybody wants to find it, they can read it. But the main point is, why is the CIA funding journalism? Why are they working with journalists to uh, push agendas? And you go back and you find out this is something I've reported not for fee, but on my own Substack. Um, in the late 1940s, like right when the CIA was born, you had George Kennan wrote a paper for the State Department, and it explored just how good the Soviets were at political warfare. And they marveled at it. They said the Soviets really understand this. Like we're way behind, and we got to be aggressive about political warfare and kind of like we don't have to look at this, like we don't have to be in war, but we need to be, do aggressively doing some of these things. And Kennan was at least, and I don't think Kennan was a terribly bad guy as far as, people that work for the Pentagon goes. I think Kennan actually had some sound principles, and got a lot right. He was an early, opponent of the Vietnam War, and I think he wasn't the worst guy, right? But it was very dangerous what he was proposing. But at least he wanted that all external. He was talking about, political warfare to topple other countries' governments and to kind of, get involved in, oh, there's an election over here in Italy. We don't want that guy to be president. What can we do? Which we know the CIA did. They were looking at is this externally. What I think has happened over recent decades, they started using this internally and looking how they can influence our own media. And to bring this full circle, like recently during the pandemic, we saw the FBI was embedded at Twitter to a degree that was just frightening. We wouldn't know this without Elon Musk and the Twitter files explored this, and you found out all these former FBI brass were working for Twitter. And they were working with current FBI officials to find out what could be said on Twitter and what couldn't, and what information needed to be censored, and what sort of punishment was meted out to those who were sharing misinformation or misleading the public. There's something horribly um, out of line there with a free press. When you have former intelligence officers working with the current intelligence state to determine what can be said on social media platforms. And I haven't looked at this one as closely, but the CIA was doing much the same with Facebook. Facebook and the CIA were working very closely together, and it helps explain why in 2020 and 2021 you'd wake up and find out somebody was banned for saying something that was, well, they said something that was true. and they discussed all of this internally. Like I said, well, that is true, but people could take the wrong impression from that. It could have harmful effects. So even if they're saying something that's true, we still can't be allowing them to say that. And so that's a different kind of media capture, but because you're working directly with social media, but it shows how involved the US government is in media, social media, and these different publications, whether it's NPR or PBS or the New York Times. They're working with and I think they're doing exactly what they were in the 1970s. They have certain people that they're working closely with, and these journalists want that. They love being singled out by the CIA or the FBI to get a trip over here. I wish we had more transparency on that. We probably will one day, and somebody will do a great dissertation and look at just how involved these intelligence agencies were with media, even if we don't know exactly which reporters they were working with. But it's really fascinating when you look at it. Gloria Steinem was one. You find out, she was a famous feminist. She was working for the CIA. She talked about it and had no problems, doing it. I think she was proud about it too. But I think the big takeaway here is the U.S. government should not be involved in domestic journalism. They shouldn't be involved in any of this. Why are we funding this? Why is it allowed? And why aren't we talking about it? I think the reason we're not talking about it is media is not talking about it. They have
Right.
an interest in not talking about it. So I think in that sense, when we talk about captured media, I think they are captured to an extent. And you have Washington, D.C. has its agendas. And to bring this back to Milei, they don't want to see a person like Milei having success in Argentina. Milei stands for everything. It stands against everything they support.
There's, I think, at least three things that come to my mind. One, when it comes to media bias, whether a result of media capture or just their normal biases, is it doesn't have to take the form of lying, right? It can take the simple form of what stories you choose to cover, how you choose to cover them. Like, for instance, they might say, say a tax is proposed on coffee, and they present it as the government needs new revenue to help the poor, and thus they want to tax, this item that isn't a necessity. People don't have to have it. So that's how they report it. Or somebody else comes along and may say, this is another example of government overreach. It's taxation is theft. If people want to drink coffee, they should be able to. They're reporting on the same exact thing, just the focus is different, or they could just ignore a story like that altogether. So that's the first thing, is it doesn't necessarily have to be lies. Second is what this type of thing leads to. I think skepticism of the media is always warranted. But to take that to the level where you say whatever the media reports is not true is very dangerous, because now you're just shutting off an outlet or an inlet maybe for information. Finally, what I really hate about this is the misdiagnosis of the problem. There's this case, I think it was yesterday or today, they're going to hear arguments, I think today, in the Supreme Court about state laws regulating who social media can ban and who they can't ban. That is to treat social media as if it's the problem and violate the freedom of the owners of those companies to operate how they want. What needs to happen is they need to get legislation or court decisions, whatever, to get government agents the hell out of these organizations. That is the problem.
I totally agree. And I don't think you can discuss, media capture without talking about Julian Assange a little bit. Assange was, last week he had his hearing whether or not he'd be extradited to the United States to face 17 charges that he's facing, mostly related to espionage, for leaking a video that was given to him by Bradley Manning at the time, not Chelsea Manning. Assange shared that video, and has been, for the last almost 15 years, a wanted man because of it. He will probably find out in March whether or not he'll be extradited. But you don't see anybody in media talking about why Assange should go free, right? Like nobody at these major institutions are. You hear some people on Twitter or, but these major media companies aren't. And I think it goes back to the fact that Assange became enemy number one to the CIA, to the FBI, to these agencies who saw him as a very serious threat. But this is a stark contrast. Go back to Daniel Ellsberg when Ellsberg published the Pentagon Papers, right? I say he published, he didn't actually publish them. And the New York Times published them and some others. He was the leaker in that case. But Ellsberg had enormous support from media. Assange isn't getting that report today. And I think it is because of a form of media capture. These institutions are loyal to the state now. Like again, these are supposed to be watchdogs to those in power. There's nobody more powerful than Washington D.C., the Pentagon, the CIA, but they don't hold those institutions and individuals to account. They're focused more on getting their message out, right? I think if you look, so much of the information is coming out. It's that the FBI wants out, or the CIA. And here's a perfect example. There was a wonderful New York Times story published just a couple days ago, and it's on the U.S. involvement, the CIA involvement specifically in Ukraine. And you find out we've had bases in Ukraine for a decade, right? These CIA bases that are all sprinkled all over. And the New York Times, again, great piece, and they are citing, they're revealing classified information here. Nobody's getting arrested. That's why Assange was arrested. The difference is the New York Times is reporting classified information with the consent of the CIA. Like this is this piece is designed to get information the CIA wants out there. So this is the old game in Washington. It's okay to share classified information. It's okay to share state secrets. When you're sharing the secrets, they're fine with you sharing. When you share the secrets they don't want you to share, like an Apache helicopter mowing down a group of people, which is what Assange shared, a collateral murder video. And if you look at that video, it's really tough to watch because it looks like kind of cold murder because you might have a guy in there with an AK-47 or like, I'm not saying none of the people in there were unarmed, but what you had were rules of engagement that I find troubling. They just mowed down a bunch of people, including two Reuters journalists. And those Reuters journalists were like, hey, what happened? And they were being lied to. They were being lied to over and over. And then Assange releases the video and they make the Pentagon look like fools. They may have exposed people committing war crimes. It was a very serious thing. That's why they brought hell and thunder down on Assange because of that. He was sharing classified info that was not stuff they wanted out there. So when the New York Times does it, like they can live with that, like in that punch, that is a form of media capture to me. And I think you have Washington D.C. that are their influence over major media is deeply troubling. They have way too much influence, and there's not enough reporters that are going to go and publish a story and get that story greenlighted by an editor if the CIA or whoever in Washington says, you know what, we really don't want that. But I will say it's not all government. You saw plenty. Go back to Harvey Weinstein, right? How many of these papers had stories on Weinstein? They did. They had lots of stories. Nobody, but before I don't remember if it was Ronan Farrow was working for the
I
New
think it was
Yorker.
Ronan Farrow. He was working, I
Yeah,
believe, I want to say the New Yorker. I'm not
I think it
positive, but
was.
I think it was New Yorker.
He reported the story that everybody else had but wouldn't report. So media capture works in that way too. I just think those stories pale in comparison to the media capture we're witnessing, where government is influencing what is being published in ways that we really can't even comprehend.
Now, to me, the good news, which is a double-edged sword, is that we're not in the past. I mean, obviously, but now we've got all kinds of alternative sources of information, whether it be Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, or talk radio, Fox News, Newsmax. It's all over there. The double-edged sword part of it is that we also now have access to an abundance of misinformation. How do you sort through that as a consumer? For instance, I'll be on Twitter and somebody will make a claim, whatever it is. I'll Google their claim, and an abundance of articles come up that say that their claim's wrong. But now, when you tell them, look, X, 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 and X all dispute what you're saying, they just say, yes, they're all part of the conspiracy or they're all lying, whatever. And then they can find an article from somewhere and they say, look, my guy says this is what I believe. That I- I'm not suggesting anything should be done about it externally, but as a society of media consumers, what can we do to make sure that we're getting accurate information upon which to make our decisions?
Um, First thing, you got to slow down, right? I think everybody who among us has not like just retweeted something and you didn't actually go verify whether that's true. I I have, and when I I'll say the second answer is this: when you screw up, own it. Like say my bad, and you remove a tweet, or you say okay, you go and you correct it. And I don't see a lot of people doing that. For what I see a lot of these people, I don't care if it's the left or the right, they make mistakes and they don't seem to care that they're sharing misinformation or disinformation or whatever. That's a problem. And I see it everywhere. Like people don't care. They care more about narrative than truth. So that's not an easy thing to fix. Now, I will say this: I don't. Glenn Greenwald has said this over and over. I don't think anyone has shared more misinformation than the mainstream media, and they're doing it though often because they're getting misinformation from government sources and so forth. And you see a lot of these stories have never been corrected. Like you find out, oh, this is all false. And once in a while, you'll see they'll go back and correct it, but usually they don't. And we can rattle off all these stories, like from the CIA's, the I don't want to say just the CIA, the U.S. and former U.S. intelligence officers say, the Hunter Biden laptop is Russian disinformation. Everyone ran with that. And the people that signed that letter knew it wasn't true for one. And then we find out later that there was a political motive there that they admitted to under oath that they wanted it to help Joe Biden. They coordinated with the Biden administration to do this. How many of those media went back and corrected that story? Bet you not many. You'll see it every once in a while. In fact, I wrote about this. I think that the New York Times did correct it, and the Washington Post didn't, or vice versa. Which is even funnier, right? Like when some media are like, okay, I'm going to go back and correct this, and other ones are like, no, I'm not going to bother. But here's the thing, individuals should do this on Twitter. But when you have major media companies that they report things that are outright false, and they don't go back and fix them even when that is exposed, that's a big problem. And I think it's because of the way media works today. We work so fast, and we're just pumping stuff out, whether or not it's true. um, we don't really care. And you know what? When you go back and correct something, then you look foolish. So the ones that do it, they only do it because they're getting called out on it, and they get a bunch of pressure to do it. If it's a small thing, they're probably not going to go correct it. And we need to go back and to this culture where we actually care about truth, where we care about our facts. When our facts are wrong, we retract the story, right? How many of those other stories were retracted when we saw just how false they are? It's rare to see a story retracted today. It shouldn't be, because we get a lot wrong, and that's of every. I don't care if you're Fox News or MSNBC. There's a lot of stories that are reported, and it turns out it's wrong. Have a full retraction, own it. But people aren't doing that. That's not the culture of media today, and we're worse for it. But I think it really starts with believing in truth over narrative.
It's funny you mentioned the tweeting things that turn out not to be true. I'm relatively new to social media. I mean, I've only been on for a year now. But when I first got on, I would be on Facebook and a quote would come across my feed that I liked. So I'd share the quote. And then people would tell, yeah, that person didn't say that. It never in my wildest imagination occurred to me that these things would be coming across my feed that would be fake quotes. But, so I looked into it and sure enough, it was fake. And I stopped doing that unless I checked the source first. But there's so much information that comes through Twitter and Facebook that I think you're right. It takes time to actually fact check. Let me look into this. Let me see if it's a good source. When it's just so easy to hit that share button, oh yay, share, and then you're part of the become part of the problem.
Yeah, it really is true. And just to make a point, Adam Kinzinger is kind of one of my punching bags, right? He's a former GOP congressman, but he's on Twitter all the time, uh, and he shares like so much stuff that like anything that kind of supports he's like so many people in social media. If someone's saying what you like, you amplify it. If someone shares something you don't like, you attack them. And he was involved in one of my favorite misinformation or disinformation. It's probably closer to disinformation than misinformation. When this goes back to the ghost of Kiev. Remember that story when the ghost of Kiev was shooting down Russian pilots like crazy, and it was a story that just captured everyone. And it was war propaganda. There was no ghost of Kiev. And Kinzinger was so eager, he fell for a stupid meme that was you have a guy in a jet fighter and a head superimposed that was like twice as big. And it was a really bad Photoshop, really fake. And Kinzinger was like amplifying this and like the ghost of Kiev strikes again. And like he was duped over war propaganda. And and that wasn't even the propaganda. That was a joke about the propaganda. And my point in this is not just to make a little fun of Kinzinger, who I think uses social media in a really bad way, but to show how when we start to care more about the narrative than what's actually true, you make those mistakes more and more. And then you don't own them. And Kinzinger actually, I think, deleted the tweet finally because he was getting mocked so much. But I don't think he would have. I don't think he would have cared he was wrong if he wasn't getting hammered over it so much. And most of us, I say most of us, I really work hard not to use social media that way, but so many people really do use social media that way. They want to just attack their opponents and amplify the things that they agree with, and they're not usually that concerned about what's true and what's not true. We need to care more, because when we don't, it just leads to the sort of confusion that lowers the level of discourse, and makes media, both journalism and social media, makes it much worse.
Okay, is there anything we didn't cover about media capture that you think is important that we should talk about before I let you go?
I think we covered a lot of ground. It's one of those things, and I won't even claim to be by any stretch a expert on media capture. It's one of these things, I've been reading a little bit more about, but then you start to connect it with history and just see, with when you look at intelligence agencies and you understand like why are they so interested in media, and you realize the state really has a desire and a need to shape opinion, right? And because their power rests on where does power come from? I think it's something Mises said decades ago. It comes through ideology, and that's why it's so important to the state to be able to shape minds, to shape ideology, and because their power rests on it, and that's why they're so interested in it. And I think people really should be. I think we need to realize that what is the purpose of government? What is the purpose of the law? It's not to shape opinion. Like it's just not. So I think we need to get government out of media altogether. That is not its role. And when you embrace it as its role, you end up with 1984. When you say like it is the purpose of government to be shaping ideology, to be shaping opinion, you end up with a very, very dark dystopian state of affairs.
You mentioned the purpose of government, and the best introductory book to the purpose of government I've ever read was a book on the inside of which I got the address for the Foundation of Economic Education in prison in 2000 and wrote to them and got a free subscription to Ideas on Liberty. That book was The Law by Frederick Bastiat. And in its simplicity, it is so elegant in its description of the purpose of government. I would highly recommend it to anybody that hasn't read it. Okay, John, where can people find you?
Yeah, first that's just a great story. The law was one of those books for me too. Like when I opened that book, I said, why hadn't I been told this before? Like why, and I was probably in my early 20s. I'm like, why isn't this book talked about? And that is like one of Fee's favorite works, and that's a great story that you received that in prison. So um, thanks for sharing that. As far as our work, the Foundation for Economic Education, we exist on fee.org, fee.org, and it's an organization I'm proud to be part of because it's an organization that we kind of, we're not so worried about politics. We are worried about the ideas. We're worried about freedom, and if you want to be a free society, if you want to be a prosperous society, you need to have the right individuals, you need to have the right ideas. And FEE is all about exploring those ideas, sharing those ideas with others. So check out our website if you haven't been there. I publish at Substack as well, and it's under the Take by Jon Miltimore. I publish there almost every day. And a lot of it's on economics, a lot of it's on ideas, some of it's just more on pop culture and reflections. But you can find my work there, and um, yeah, check out our content on Fee as well.
Thanks a lot, John.
Yeah,
For
great chatting
now,
with you, Michael.
this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.